Right, and hello everyone. We are in for this week's topic video, and going ahead with this week, we are going to go ahead and get the president video out of the way for the month of May. And last month, we had gone over Mr. Franklin Delano Roosevelt. That was the president that we covered last month. I don't think I have it on me, so we'll forego that today. But oh, there it is. So for this month's president, we are on number 33 at this point. FDR was our 32nd. FDR died in office right toward the end of World War II, and he is succeeded by his vice president at the time, Mr. Harry Truman. So we're going to discuss for today's video, we're going to discuss Harry Truman. We're going to discuss, as we usually do, go over a little bit of the history of terms of his background before he became president, and then we'll delve into the topic of his presidency and after post presidency as well, going into that. So for Harry Truman, and this it's kind of a shame I didn't get to this video maybe a week earlier because we could have done this on his birthday. His birthday would have been this month. He was born on May 8th of 1884 in Lamar, Missouri. He was definitely a Missouri man, and he was throughout the most of his life. He lived in Missouri. He never really moved out of the state. He was a son of livestock trader John Truman and Martha, and his mother was Martha Young Truman. The S in his middle name, he was called Harry S. Truman, but the S conspicuously in Mr. Truman's name did not really mean any particular name. It was given as his middle initial by his parents to honor two of his grandfathers who had either had a first name start with S or a middle name that started with one. But it was never decided of a particular name of what the S stood for. It was just to simply, be in remembrance of his grandfathers, to give respect to them, to represent them. But according to Harry himself, it never actually meant any particular name to him. It was just a middle initial to give him that he used throughout his life. In 1890, so at the age of 6, Truman and his family ended up moving from Lamar and several other small towns in Missouri that they had moved to, and they end up moving to what will become Mr. Truman's hometown of Independence, Missouri, which is, I believe, just outside of Kansas City. I could be wrong on that, but that Independence, Missouri is where Harry Truman will spend most of his adult life. That is where he makes his hometown, much like President Lincoln had done with Springfield, Illinois. Truman, upon arriving with his family in Independence, Missouri, he ends up attending school for the first time. He had not attended school prior to this, right? But plus, he was only about age 6, so he'd be about the equivalent of modern day, maybe first grader. So he ends up beginning to attend school, and he does very well in school academically, and even takes up a love of piano playing and music, of which he becomes quite skilled in later life. Truman would end up dreaming during his teenage years of a career in the army. He dreamed about joining the US military and maybe even attending the military academy at West Point and becoming, a regular army soldier. Unfortunately for Truman, he is plagued by bad eyesight. He has very bad eyesight as a youngster. He never really got over it, of course, and that facilitated that he needed these very large glasses in order to see correctly. And because of his eyesight, it would pretty much disqualify him from ever getting into West Point because West Point had, a fit regimen that they wanted from an American soldier, and they didn't want a soldier that didn't have good eyesight because that, of course, could be a threat to not only themselves but to the others around them, especially if you're firing a gun and you can't really tell what you're shooting at. So Truman is very early. He very quickly finds out that because of his poor eyesight, it's going to prevent him from pursuing any kind of a career going into West Point Academy, and it's pretty much going to bar him from ever going there. So he ends up switching gears very early on in his life. So Truman ends up graduating high school in Independence, Missouri in 1901, and he will hold several jobs, including that of a bank clerk, which was all done in Independence. He would also run a couple of other jobs for I think that his father had helped him get. His father was a little bit involved with democratic politics at the time, and that helped Truman to also get in there a little bit. But he held a little bit odds and ends jobs between 1901 and 1905, so about the first 4 years of his modern adult life. Between 1905 and 1911, he would end up serving in the Missouri National Guard, which did not bar him from service. And he really only got into the Missouri National Guard because he had lied about his eyesight in a way. He memorized the eye chart that would be used for the eye test and actually managed to memorize that eye chart so completely that on the second time he was able to pass the eye test just out of memory, not because he was actually being able to correctly read it, but because he knew what it said on every single line when they said it. So he kind of cheated his way into the Missouri National Guard, but he ended up getting a little bit of a career out of it and a little bit of notoriety as well. During that same period from 1905 to 1911, Truman would also help to manage his family's 600-acre farm with his father. His father would sadly end up passing away in 1914. In April of 1917, Truman would end up reenlisting in the Missouri National Guard after he had dropped out in 1911 to really focus on concerns at home. And he ended up reenlisting with the Missouri National Guard in April of 1917 when the United States officially entered World War I. And he was sent to the battlefields in France as part of the American Expeditionary Force that was sent to Europe following America's entry into the war. He would lead his own division of the Missouri National Guard. It was an artillery division that he was in charge of, and they would go through several actual live fire campaigns during their time over in France, including that of the infamous Meuse Argonne offensive. That was to this day one of the bloodiest, if not the bloodiest, campaign ever witnessed by the American army. During his time as over in Europe as part of this artillery division that he is in charge of. Truman is actually the captain of this artillery division. He would actually have a little bit of a standout. He deliberately, on one occasion, disobeyed orders that he had to stay put when he noticed that there was a German artillery battery that was moving on the other side of the river and was going to be, once it was set up, would be able to stop bombarding another group of American troops that was set to come across. And upon seeing this, and even though he had orders to stay put and not to hold a concealed position and, don't let the enemy know who you are. He ends up disobeying those orders and manages to order his men to fire on this German artillery battery, which ends up being a success. They knock out the battery and thus saving the lives of several hundred American troops that otherwise might have been killed had this battery remained there that they were able to spot. He would also demonstrate during his time in World War I as captain of this artillery division. He would demonstrate effective leadership skills and a success record that really raised his notoriety within the National Guard and also raised his notoriety at home for his successful war service. And it also got him, of course, the appreciation of his men that he had commanded. He would be honorably discharged from the National Guard in April of 1919 after the war had come to an end in November of the previous year. So Harry Truman is also a World War One vet. So that's a first for a president because he's also most presidents before this did not no president before this had served in World War One, which we discussed just with Woodrow Wilson back in November. So, upon returning home to Independence, Missouri, Truman would end up marrying a former childhood classmate of his named Elizabeth Wallace. She went by the nickname of Bess. They had a very happy marriage. In fact, it was a very long lived one. Mind you, that Truman ended up living to like 88 years old, and Bess, I believe, lived to like 98. She was almost 100 when she died. And they would have one child together. Their daughter, Mary Margaret Truman, was their only daughter that they ended up having. Also, in that same year, when Truman came home, not only did he decide to get married, he also decided to open up a men's clothing store in Kansas City with a friend. However, unfortunately, due to the rackety economy that was ensuing in the latter half of President Wilson's second term and going into the beginning of President Harding's term in the early 1920s, due to the poor economy that came about briefly after the First World War, Truman and his friend end up actually having to close the store and foreclose on it in 1922 due to it going bankrupt. And it would leave Truman with debt that he would struggle for years to actually pay off on the foreclosure of this clothing store that he had. So here we have a couple of our first pictures that we'll go ahead and show here for Mr. Truman. So this is a picture of him, I believe, at about the age of, let me double check on the age here. I just want to make sure I get the age right for him. Yeah, so this is about 1897. This would be Mr. Truman at age 13. He already has the big glasses on that he will wear throughout his life because of his poor eyesight, and that kind of at times became an inhibitor, and at other times, didn't bother him at all. And here we have a picture of him in 1918 over in France in uniform during the First World War. So right here is he is in the uniform of his artillery division. And then here we have a picture of him and Bess on their wedding day in June of 1919. And I think that one goes with it. Okay. So we can wait here a bit. So, upon coming home from the service in 1919, it is going to be shortly after that that Truman is going to start what will become his political career that will raise him to the office of the presidency. And he doesn't start off in the most, famous of ways, as some politicians do. They go right for the big ones right off the bat. They go right off for like a House seat or a Senate seat or something like that, and then they go up. Truman did not get that at first. Truman started off small. In 1922, so about 3 years after he ends up coming home, he ends up being elected as the district judge in his county in Missouri, in Jackson County, Missouri, as a Democrat. He was in charge of handling county finances, public works projects, etc., basic utility work around the county. He would then also be elected as a presiding county judge in 1926 of Jackson County and would gain a reputation for both integrity and efficiency in his job, which would only serve to get him reelected to the post in 1930 when he came up for reelection. So he starts off as a low level local government guy. He starts out on the county level and kind of moves up the political ladder. In 1934, Truman would end up running for and be elected to the U.S. Senate as a senator from Missouri. So that's a big leap, reading from the county and then going up to U.S. Senate. He would end up during his time, of course, he comes into the Senate, into Congress on the wave of Democratic success following the outbreak of the Great Depression and people blaming Herbert Hoover and his Republican Party for a large majority of the economic downturn. So he rides this blue wave that comes in the early 1930s that ushers in Franklin Roosevelt as president. It ushers in Democratic majorities in the House and the Senate, and that allows Truman to come in there. And of course, being that he's riding this blue wave, he doesn't want to really go against what the voters are saying, so he supports FDR's New Deal programs almost wholeheartedly, with very few reservations throughout the 1930s, as the Democrats under Roosevelt are trying to fix the economy and trying to get it back on track. He would help pass a couple of major acts during his time as a U.S. senator. He would pass the Civil Aeronautics. He was critical to the passage of the Civil Aeronautics Act of 1938, which would establish government regulation of the aviation industry. And he would also be critical for the passage of the Transportation Act of 1940, which would establish new federal regulations for railroad, shipping, and trucking industries within the United States. This comes up to World War II. So during World War II, Truman does not go back into the National Guard. He had been a reservist for some time, but he wasn't required to return to duty, and he opted not to. He opted to retain his Senate seat during the time and serve in Congress. So, as World War I is going on after 1941, the United States is engaged. Truman is head of the Senate Special Committee from 1941 to 44, and the Senate Special Committee to investigate the National Defense Program. And this was a committee that was set up by the U.S. Congress in order to seek to reduce waste and mismanagement of U.S. military spending that was being done during the war. Truman was a member of this committee, and this committee is credited with actually helping to save thousands of tax dollars in tax money that was being mismanaged for the national military effort in World War II, and it gave Truman national fame as a consequence of this. Now, when FDR now Truman unexpectedly kind of gets propelled into the presidency before he never has shown any desire to get into the White House. That has never seemed to be a major desire of Truman's. He never has expressed any, heartfelt desire that he longed to maybe run for it one day. It is kind of sprung up on him in 1944 because in 1944, as we discussed in the last video, it's an unconventional election year because President FDR, Franklin Roosevelt, he is now at the end of what has been his historic third term, which has never happened before with a US president. FDR decides that despite his declining health, I'm going to run for a fourth one, despite the factor that his health is in utter decline. His health is getting worse and it's worrying members of his party. Kind of like how, I mean, to draw a parallel here, kind of like how last year when President Joe Biden had initially he was running for reelection at first, and then after his disastrous debate performance and more, details coming out of the White House that, he has really declined, and people could see it. We all saw it, but seeing how the president was, his health was going downhill, maybe not so much physically, but mentally, and seeing that, and that caused him to end up dropping out. Well, imagine the same scenario, but FDR, instead of dropping out, he decides I'm going to run, and he ends up running. And the problem with the Democratic Party is they realize that whoever is going to be vice president to FDR, we're not doubting that he couldn't possibly win a fourth term, but what we are concerned about is he won't complete a fourth term. He may die in office. That is a very good likelihood. Now, Roosevelt already had a vice president. He had Henry Wallace, but Henry Wallace was a very divisive figure within the Democratic Party. He was much more of a leftist, like a hard leftist. He was a hard liberal compared to some of his more moderate colleagues, and that worried some members of the party. They didn't like the idea of Wallace becoming president if Roosevelt were to die. So there were members of the party going into the 1944 convention that said, if we're going to nominate Roosevelt for a fourth term, you need to pick a new running mate, someone that is going to appease the moderates within the party. And almost as kind of a compromise, Truman is picked out of almost nowhere for being a moderate Democrat and having national fame. He is now going to be FDR's new running mate. And if FDR gets that fourth term, he will be the new vice president that will take over if FDR dies. And sure enough, that ends up happening because Roosevelt ends up winning the 1944 election, and Truman becomes vice president on January 20th of 1945, toward the very last few months of World War II. And then, as we know, it goes south pretty quick. Now, what indication we had that Truman honestly expected that he was going to become president, I don't know. I don't know if we have any of those indications that Truman, honestly, the God, thought it was just a waiting game, or if he was generally surprised, as it seems that he more than likely was when the day came. But we will never know if, like, he went into the office of the vice president expecting that, somewhere during these 4 years, I'm going to end up being the president. So during his brief time as vice president of the United States from just January to April of 1945, Truman is actually largely kind of left out of a lot of important government workings, the inner workings of the administration. He is not briefed by FDR on a lot of the administration's military planning, a lot of the administration's, projects or anything that it has going on. Most notably, he is not told about the Manhattan Project that was developing the first atomic bomb until after he became president. Even though he had been vice president for a couple months at that point, he was not told until shortly after being sworn into office that, oh yeah, we have this project that we've been working on a nuclear device. He's like, you've been working on what? He's like, "What do you mean you've been working on a nuclear device? I've been vice president for like 4 months and I've been told nothing of this. And you're telling me this has been going on for like 12 years?" So it kind of shocked Truman to a degree that he wasn't always filled in as he thought he should have been as vice president. So, as we all know, FDR does not end up completing his fourth term, and it does seemingly come as a surprise to Truman. Truman does seemingly come out thinking that, he comes out rather shocked when it ends up actually occurring. So FDR ends up dying on April 12th of 1945, just about 4 months into his fourth term, and that then propels Truman into the presidency. And what from Truman's account, he had not been told that the president had been dead, I don't think yet, if I recall correctly, that he had been called to the White House upon them getting the news that FDR had died at in Georgia at his Warm Springs little therapy resort that he had. And Truman gets into the White House and he ends up meeting the first person he ends up meeting is First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt. And he asks her what's his he literally asks her what's wrong, and Eleanor Roosevelt informs Harry that Franklin's dead. He's died. Truman automatically realize the shock not fully setting in yet. His first thought is, "Oh my God, Mrs. Roosevelt, I'm so sorry." And he literally asks her, "Is there anything I can do for you?" And in that moment where he's thinking more about her, Eleanor is the one that kind of turns it around and says, "Well, no, Harry. I think the question is there anything we can do for you? You're president now." And Roosevelt, not Roosevelt, but Truman's later recollection of that day was that he felt, and this is a quote that he ended up saying at the time, is quote, "I felt like the moon, the stars, and all the planets had fallen on me," because he realizes that with the presidency now devolving on him, it is now his job to wrap up this war that has utterly devastated the world for the past, going on 6 years at this point. He is gonna have to oversee the defeat of the Nazis in Germany, and he's gonna have to oversee the final defeat of the Japanese in the Pacific, and that is now all under his command. Roosevelt has commanded the American presidency at this point for 12 years, and now for the first time, you got someone that's gonna be in there that doesn't have a previous 10 years worth of experience in this position to actually bring everything to a close, and Truman did feel like there was a lot of weight on him as the incoming president to actually fulfill and get this done. So Truman would be immediately sworn in on April 12th of 1945, becoming the 33rd president, which before we go into his presidency here, we'll do a couple of the more photos that we have. So this is a photo of Truman in 1944 when during the Democratic presidential campaign of that year, where he's now not been nominated for vice president. He's meeting with his mother, who was still alive at this point. He did get to see her son become president as well. She died, I believe, in 1947. So that's him actually visiting his mother at home in Missouri. And then here we have a Democratic ticket poster from the 1944 election with both FDR and Truman's face on it. And then here we have a picture of the moment where Truman is being sworn in on April 12th after the death of President Roosevelt, which okay. So Truman is, as we mentioned, his immediate concern upon assuming the office of the presidency is ending World War II. It is the most devastating conflict in human history already at this point. It needs to come to an end. And now he is in charge of bringing that to an end. And as we mentioned, upon becoming president, only upon becoming president did Truman even learn about the development of the atomic bomb, which is consequential because he'll end up being the only president in history and the only human figure in human history to ever order the use of a nuclear weapon in warfare, which we'll go into here shortly. So, coincidentally, he doesn't have to wait long for the war in Europe to come to an end. Nazi Germany, within 2 weeks of Roosevelt's death, Hitler is dead. He commits suicide or escapes, depending on what your theory is of what actually happened. And Nazi Germany ends up officially surrendering on May 8th, none other than Truman's birthday. So it was kind of a birthday present to him to hear that the war in Europe was over. Germany had surrendered. So by May, the war is over in Europe, and for a lot of the European countries, that's the end of World War II because the war's over in Europe. But for us, it wasn't over. We had another enemy left. The last Axis power remaining is Japan, and we're engaged with Japan in a brutal fight in the Pacific. So in July 1945, Truman would travel to the German capital, the devastated German capital of Berlin, for the Potsdam Conference in order to meet with British Prime Minister Winston Churchill and Soviet Premier Joseph Stalin. He would learn while he was there at Potsdam that there had been a successful test of the atomic bomb known as the Trinity test on July 16th. He would hint to Stalin after hearing word of this test. He would kind of hint to Stalin that the US now had a new weapon to use against Japan. And to his knowledge, that was the first time he ever let on to the Soviets that the United States had a nuclear weapon. However, what Truman was not aware of was that there were Soviet spies within the American nuclear program, within the Manhattan Project, and Stalin had already known about the development of the atomic bomb for a couple years now, which would also lead into the start of the Cold War as this mutual distrust and, suspicion of the United States and the Soviet Union going at each other. Now, Japan would end up refusing. At the Potsdam Conference, the Allies basically issue an ultimatum to Japan. They issue surrender unconditionally they kind of hint at the fact that they have this big weapon that has never been used before that will be used if you continue to resist, and they basically issue to Japan, you need to surrender unconditionally. You are the last remaining Axis power left. The whole world is against you at this point. Surrender and, spare yourselves the bloodshed. Japan refuses to surrender, mostly because they were absolutely insistent that they would not accept the emperor being forced to abdicate. They did not want the emperor abdicating. That was a big no negotiating position for them. So, because of Japan continuing its brutal tactics that it is using in order to defend itself, and that's we're going to go into that here in a hot minute because that comes into a little bit of a discussion. And then because of the innumerous lives that are going to be estimated to be caused, Truman argues, okay, we're going to possibly have to drop these two bombs, and hopefully, it will convince the Japanese to change their tune and surrender. He thought Truman thought, honestly, that the use of the two nuclear bombs that the United States had would save up to possibly 1,000,000 lives on both sides of the aisle, both the Allies and the Japanese, that would otherwise be lost if the Allies were actually forced to invade the Japanese islands as they were already planning to do going into 1946. So Truman becomes the first and only president and only human figure in history to order the use of two nuclear weapons in warfare, as he orders that the two atomic bombs, Little Boy and Fat Man, be dropped on the two Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which would kill over 109,000 people in a matter of seconds. Japan would agree to surrender after the dropping of the two bombs in August of 1945, which would officially bring an end to World War II after 6 long years. Now, going into the debate, there has been the debate ever since August of 1945. Was Truman in the right to order the dropping of the two nuclear weapons? Because nowadays you say, 109,000 people in instance, vaporizing people in seconds. That is rather gruesome. I mean, and destroying a whole city, that's another matter. There's no doubt about it. Nuclear weapons are absolutely horrible. They should not exist. They should not be on this earth. They need to be eradicated because they're an absolute danger to ourselves as a species. But I must say that I also get where Truman is coming from because what Truman and many other U.S. officials were making is the war could go on another year or two, and they were already drawing up plans to invade the Japanese home islands. They had already seen going on the island hopping campaign in the Pacific on islands like Iwo and Okinawa, how the Japanese were so desperate to fight. There was no surrender with the Japanese. They would rather do a banzai charge or order the civilians and themselves to commit suicide than surrender. Surrender was unhonorable to them, and thus they would aim to take out as many as they could before dying. Imagine going into the Japanese home islands. They already knew what the Japanese military was going to act like. But the fact that Japanese civilians had also been doing this, had also been committing mass suicide, had also been going in and been suicide bombers in a way, they also kind of made the realization the Japanese civilian population could be just as involved with the defense of the home islands as the Japanese military. And imagine how many lives more would have been lost on our side and theirs if those bombs had not been dropped. The war could have gone on another 2 years and cost another 2 million lives if they had not been dropped. That's something that I don't think I like of the Japanese education system. I've read and also seen a couple times where in Japan they kind of glance over a lot of the dirtier aspects that Japan did during the Second World War. And I'm not saying we're perfect either, but Japan, in large part, from what I've seen, their education system tends to kind of glance over it in ways. And then they come to the atomic bombs and they act like the United States has absolutely no reason for ever needing to drop those two bombs. And I'm thinking, but didn't we? Didn't you literally have bonsai charges? You literally had kamikaze pilots. Pilots who flew Japanese aircraft loaded with bombs, whose only mission was to take these planes that they were piloting and deliberately crash them and kill themselves into an enemy aircraft carrier or a battleship. Suicide planes. So when the Japanese education system tries to makes it seem like the United States, for no reason at all, had any reason to drop a nuclear weapon, I kind of disagree because the Japanese had shown extremist lengths that they were taking to avoid an invasion of the home islands. I think, in a way, it almost necessitated it. Because imagine what would have happened had they not. We had already seen the Japanese had put forth a thing ahead of time of what they were willing to do to avoid defeat. Now, whether that was the true wish of the civilian people, I don't think it was, because at this time Japan is largely controlled by the military. I think it was more of a military standpoint, and we'll never know. We never know that if the invasion had taken place, if the civilian population would have willingly gone along with the military telling them to commit suicide. We don't know. But based on the prior record, it's not entirely, fiction. It's not entirely a fantasy to imagine that they could have. It was very much a possibility. I believe, and Truman knew that there was criticism throughout his life for the decision that he had made to drop those two bombs. And in 1948, he had actually issued this statement that he had said regarding that decision. And this was his statement that he said regarding to drop the two atomic bombs. It was this: As President of the United States, I had the fateful responsibility of deciding whether or not to use this weapon for the first time. It was the hardest decision I ever had to make. But the President cannot duck hard problems. He cannot pass the buck. I made the decision after discussions with the ablest men in our government and after long and prayerful consideration. I decided that the bomb should be used to end the war quickly and save countless lives, Japanese as well as American. So you can go either way of the opinion that you want. I'm not saying one way's wrong and one way's right. It's just I tend to agree with what Truman is kind of getting at because I see the track record that the Japanese had set beforehand that kind of put some serious concerns over what it would take to actually end the war if we hadn't dropped the bombs. So the end of World War II was followed by the emergence of the Cold War that would persist up until just 30 years ago in 1991 with the Soviet Union. Truman would end up adopting, at the start of it, a policy of the containment of communism and Soviet expansion, realizing that the Soviets had no intention of setting up democratic governments, that they had agreed to do so in 1940 at the 1945 Yalta Conference, that they had no intention of setting up these democratic governments in, the countries of Eastern Europe that they had liberated from the Nazis, and that they were setting up communist regimes against their will, and also fomenting revolution and insurrection elsewhere where governments were weakened by the war, such as Greece and Turkey. So in 1947, Truman would introduce what would become known as the Truman Doctrine to provide aid to both Greece and Turkey against the communist rebels that were Soviet backed there. He would also institute the Marshall Plan, which would give billions of dollars in aid to help rebuild the economies of Europe and those countries as a whole, arguing to critics of the bill of the Marshall Plan that countries that their economies are bad and have weak infrastructure and are devastated are more susceptible to communism. If we rebuild them and get these democracies back on the economic table, they'll be able to actually fend for themselves, and communism won't be so appealing. And it was optional, it was voluntary. The United States even offered Marshall Plan aid to the Soviet Union. They offered it to all the countries of Eastern Europe, but because the Soviet Union thought there was, strings attached or something like that, they utterly rejected it and encouraged their allies to do so as well. The only communist nation in Europe after post World War II that accepted Marshall Plan aid was Yugoslavia, which was not always under the Soviet sphere. They kind of went their own path. But it was offered to every nation in Europe to get this aid that the United States was willing to give them to help rebuild these countries after the war. In 1948, the US would also airlift food and other supplies into the German city of Berlin, into the western sectors of Berlin, after the Soviets had blockaded the entire city from the west. They had decided it was in East Germany. Berlin was divided into four sectors by the victorious Allied powers, one being British, one American, one French, and one Soviet. However, Berlin was in the part of Germany that was this in the Soviet sector that would become East Germany, and thus the city was kind of cut off from what would become the Allied held sectors of what would become West Germany. So the Soviets, trying to take control of Berlin entirely, they blockade all the roads and land traffic into the city. So thinking that it'll force the Western Allies to actually abandon and get out of the city and hand the whole thing to us. Well, instead of doing that, Truman kind of calls Stalin's bluff. He knows Stalin is not willing to start a war right now. So he decides, well, if I send planes in there to airdrop the supplies that would keep our people and the German people in Berlin in our occupied sectors without going hungry, and they have supplies and food and everything else, then Stalin is either going to be faced with one or two choices. Does he really want to go to war right now? Because the only way he's going to stop those planes is by shooting them down, which correctly calls Stalin's bluff. The Soviets do not shoot at the planes, and the Soviets end up lifting the blockade, which was a win for Truman very early on. He would also oversee the recognition of Israel as a country in 1948 upon the foundation of that state. At home, Truman would struggle with transitioning the nation from a wartime economy to that of a peacetime one, and this was something that almost seemed like it was going to derail his presidency. At home, he was facing problems such as labor disputes, shortage of consumer goods, national railroad strikes, all manner of things that could go bad with an economy for a president went bad. And Truman's approval ratings started to fall because people thought it was his fault. And also, he also started to lose some approval rating, especially in the South, and would have been majority Democratic because for the first time, Truman starts to kind of start issuing in something along the lines of civil rights, where in 1948 he orders that the U.S. military is no longer allowed to be segregated. That he desegregated the U.S. military in 1948. The issues that the military, despite segregation still going on publicly in parts of the United States, it is no longer acceptable within the armed forces. Truman would cam he in 1948, Truman would run for re-election, but he was expected to lose rather quickly to Republican Thomas Dewey, the governor of New York. It was expected that he would not win re-election due to the poor economy. Nevertheless, due to Truman not believing, though, due to the public's perception that he was not going to win it, it didn't deter Truman from actually thinking that he had a shot. And he campaigned rather vigorously in 1948 for the second term that he wanted to get for himself of his own. And he goes around the nation in a whistle stop train campaign to give hundreds of speeches and just raise, I've done this, I've accomplished this, I know this is going on, but this is what we're going to do to solve it. His opponent, on the other hand, Thomas Dewey, was so certain of victory that he really didn't go around campaigning at all. He just kind of let it run its course. He didn't go out and do a bunch of speeches and anything like that. He thought he had it in the bag. He thought that he pretty much didn't have to work for it. It was just going to be given to him. Truman and his running mate, Alben Barkley, who was a senator from Kentucky that he would nominate to be his vice president because he hadn't had a vice president all up until this point, would end up winning unexpectedly in 1948 in a what would very surprisingly was a landslide for him. It was very unexpected that he was going to win, and there's a famous picture which we'll go ahead and show here. We'll show the other ones first here, and then we'll come back to that point. So here's a picture of Truman meeting with Churchill and Stalin at Potsdam in July 1945 after the end of World War II. And here is a picture of him in the Oval Office in August of 1945 announcing Japan's surrender and the official end of World War II. And then here we have a picture of him in 1948 with his Republican challenger, Thomas Dewey, who the guy that didn't really even try for it at all, just thought he kind of had it in the bag. And everyone so widely expected that Truman was going to lose, they didn't even challenge that notion. only to be surprised on election night when the opposite results came in. So, the 1948 presidential election results, there were 531 electoral votes. You needed 266 of them to actually win the presidency. Truman was the Democratic nominee. His Republican opponent was Thomas Dewey, and there was a third party bid by South Carolina's Governor Strom Thurmond, who I cannot believe the guy lived till 2003, and now Senator Lindsey Graham holds the post that he was in. He was literally a senator pretty much until the year he died. Within my lifetime, this guy ended up actually not dying until, but he was a third party bid that year. So, mind you, you need 266 to win. Truman takes 303 electoral votes in 1948, with Dewey only getting 189 of them. Thurmond would get 39 electoral votes as a third party candidate. Truman would win 28 states, Dewey 16, and Thurmond would win 4. The popular vote was a little more split. Truman would take 49.6% of the popular vote compared to Dewey at 45.1% and Thurmond at 2.4. And it was just an absolute shocker, I think, to many, but even Truman. And one of the memorable moments of that election night were this picture of Truman. I can't remember if it was that very night or not. I think it was that night, but the Chicago Tribune was a very pro-Republican paper at the time, and the owner was so certain that Thomas Dewey was going to end up winning the presidency in 1948 that he had already, approved the headline to go out the next day of Dewey defeats Truman. And lo and behold, the opposite happened on election night. Truman ends up actually sweeping the board, and he's in, and someone hands him a copy of this paper that's already come out of this newspaper that had already been printed out that said Dewey defeats him, and he's just laughing at it on that election night. He's just laughing at this erroneous newspaper that was so certain that Dewey was going to defeat him, and here he's laughing because he's actually won, and the newspaper was wrong. And then here is the electoral map from 1948. So as we can see, the only reason that Thurmond really did any good in the in what was traditionally the Democratic South is probably due to the factor that he had started to take a stand with civil rights a little bit by desegregating the military, and that probably didn't stand with some of those deep South states like South Carolina and Louisiana, Alabama, and Mississippi. It looks like went for him, and then there was a faithless elector in Tennessee that went for Thurmond. But Truman largely gets most of the states, except in New England. He only gets Massachusetts with that one and a couple of states out west and in the Midwest, it looks like. So Truman would begin his second term on January 20th of 1949. It was the first inauguration of a president to actually be televised at the time. Truman would set out during his second term that he has now fully won on his own. He would set out with a new social reform agenda that he would call the Fair Deal. Among the policies that he wanted to implement as part of this fair deal for the American people, Truman wanted national medical assistance to be put into he wanted the government to provide national medical assistance. He wanted assistance for farmers to be passed, federal housing programs, higher minimum wage, increases in Social Security and civil rights reforms, and a repeal of the Taft-Hartley Act, which would dealt with tariffs. I believe it was with tariffs. I could be wrong on that one. All the most of the agenda of Truman's fair deal would be passed. However, his bill looking for for national medical, protection and stuff like that, that would not be current until the 1960s when Medicare and Medicaid would come about. Now, the threat of communism would continue to be the primary focus of Truman's second administration. He very early on would support the creation of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO as we now know it, in 1949. He would also appoint Dwight Eisenhower, who had been Supreme Allied Commander during the Second World War and is an American general. He would appoint Eisenhower to be the first commander of NATO. Ironically, Eisenhower would be Truman's successor in the office of the presidency. He would end up being elected in 1952. So, despite NATO being founded in 1949, which the big thing in NATO, of course, is in Article 5, where, an attack on one NATO member nation is considered to be an attack on all. it was meant as a Soviet Union deterrent, but now it's more kind of toward Russia because Russia has shown that it cannot be trusted more often than not. So, 1949, despite the development of NATO, it did have some negative developments. One was that China, which had kind of been in a civil war between communist and nationalist forces for over 20 years at this point, ended up coming under the rule of the communists of Mao Zedong in 1949. So, China fell to communism very early on in Truman's second term. And the Soviets would also test their first atomic bomb that year, starting the Cold War nuclear arms race. Because up into from 1945 to 1949, the United States was the only nation in the world that had nuclear weapons. By 1949, now the Soviets have the bomb, and they have it so quickly, the United States was rather shocked at how quickly the Soviets got it. They thought, how on earth did they do it? How'd they do it that quick? It took us like 12 years. How'd they do it in 4? And then they slowly got the intel that the Soviets had spies in the Manhattan Project, and that was why. Because the Soviets hadn't been working from scratch. They had spies in our nuclear program. They had already had a large amount of information that they had learned, and thus it took them even less time to actually manufacture the bomb themselves. Truman also had to deal at the same time with accusations at home from from Wisconsin Senator Joseph McCarthy that his administration and the State Department had been infiltrated by communists. Now, McCarthy was pretty much a lame duck senator. He wasn't one that was known to really do much. He was actually forecasted to lose his next reelection bid, which is possibly thought of why he very likely started these accusations that there were communists in the government, and that they had infiltrated every one of the government branches. And he very famously would go around the Senate with this paper in his hand that he claimed was a list of, of communist spies that he knew were in the State Department and all the apartments of state and everything else and all the official government organizations. But coincidentally enough, when asked to ever show these names, he never would because he had none. It was a phony list. He had no names. McCarthy had absolutely no names or any actual communist spies that he knew of. He just did it for the publicity, and later he ended up getting kind of found out for the phony that he was and ended up losing his Senate seat as a result. But during the early 1950s, I mean, the Red Scare is going on. The second Red Scare is going full on in the United States, and McCarthy kind of plays into that. And he accuses Truman's administration of being just as riddled with communist spies and, wiretaps as any other. And Truman is trying to say, you're talking nonsense. I know there is no communist spies in my administration. The big final event of Truman's presidency would also be something that would kind of hurt him going into the end of it. That was the Korean War. In June of 1950, communist North Korea, which was Soviet backed, would end up invading American backed South Korea, and this would then cause the Americans under President Truman ended up sending ground troops, planes, and ships to defend South Korea's independence, and it ended up working. Unfortunately, it ended up going into a 3-year long stalemate, of which China ended up getting drawn in, and it ended up kind of bashing his approval ratings at home because it ended in this quagmire of a stalemate. Neither side was really gaining any ground, and it kind of kept hovering around the former pre war border or the 38th parallel. So the Korean War, it kinda hurt Truman's, final few years going out of office between 50 and 53. It ended up kind of hitting him rather hard at the end because people kinda blamed him for the stalemate. Because the government, he's the commander in chief. He's in charge of the US military. So if there's a stalemate going on with the military, it's because the commander in chief doesn't know what he's doing. That was not at all, I don't think, the case. I don't It was just an absolute brutal war. The nature of it, I think, kinda made it a stalemate for the longest time, but it hurt Truman's popularity at home. However, it did preserve South Korean independence, which today, South Korea and North Korea are still both around, but obviously one is still around that otherwise might not have been, had it not been for Truman's decisive action to intervene on its behalf. Truman would decide against another bid for re-election in 1952, despite the factor that he was eligible. Now, at this point, the 22nd Amendment had been passed that officially barred a president from serving more than 2 terms, but it did make an exception. If you read the amendment, it does make an exception for whoever the current incumbent is, and at the time it was Truman. It was passed during Truman's terms of office. So they did make the exception that if Truman wanted to run for a third term, he was more than welcome to do so. Truman, exercising his better judgment and seeing his declining poll numbers because approval ratings because of the Korean War, he kind of facilitates in 1952 that no, I've had my time. I'm done. I don't want to do it anymore." So he decides against running in 1952, and that year, much to his chagrin, General Eisenhower, who he had been very good friends with kind of beforehand, Truman always kind of said it was a stab in the back that Eisenhower accepted the Republican nomination and ended up running in 1952 as a Republican and ended up getting the presidency. And for a couple years, him and Eisenhower did not talk at all. It wasn't until after the assassination of President Kennedy that the two really began to get back on a talking basis again in many respects as friends, much like, John Adams and Thomas Jefferson had had almost 2 centuries earlier. So Truman will not run for re-election in 1952. Democrats lose that election year to the Republicans, and Dwight Eisenhower will be elected president. And Truman will leave office officially on January 20th of 1953. So having been in the presidency since 45. So Truman and Bess would end up traveling home to Independence, Missouri after the inauguration of Eisenhower. While at Independence in his retirement years, Truman would write his memoirs, he would meet visitors, and take daily walks around town. He would also help to raise funds for the Harry S. Truman Presidential Library, which would officially open its doors in 1957, just 4 years after he left the office. However, Truman would always kind of struggle with his finances a little bit. He didn't have a whole lot of money before becoming president, and because of the nature of his responsibilities that he wasn't able to save a whole lot of money when he was president from his presidential salary. So by the time he leaves the presidency, Truman's only source of income is his from his memoir, from the publication of his memoirs, and from an army pension of $112 a month that he's getting from the U.S. government for his army service in the First World War. So he's always kind of struggling with finances. Finances. He doesn't have a whole lot of money, and that is always kind of it dogs him during his retirement years. In the 1960s, Truman would show some criticism of the civil rights movement as it formally began to kick off, despite his earlier actions like the desegregation of the military that had seemed to be in support of them. He expressed a belief in 1960 that the sit-in movement that had been done in diners across the nation after black students were refused service at a white-only counter. He expressed belief in 1960 that the sit in movement was a communist plot, and this prompted Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. to actually publicly request evidence from Truman of this communist plot. Of how on earth was this, being orchestrated by the communists and not just by Americans stepping up for their civil rights. And he actually formally publicly requested for an apology from the former president. Truman would also criticize the Selma March in 1965, saying that it had been done merely for publicity and making a show of things. In 1964, Truman would actually suffer a fall in his home that would cause a decline in his health. And this decline in his health would continue until the day he died. But it also showed a large part his struggling finances at the same time. Now, mind you, during his presidency, Truman had advocated as part of his fair deal for national medical coverage, for the government to provide some kind of a medical insurance nationally to people that couldn't ordinarily afford it. And him and Bess were actually given the very first 2 Medicare cards by President Lyndon Johnson in 1965 when the Medicare bill ended up being signed by President Johnson at Truman's presidential library in honor of his fight for government health care while he had been in office. So he and Bess end up getting the first 2 ever Medicare cards during that event. Unfortunately, Truman would not get to live much longer. He would end up passing away. He ended up developing pneumonia in early December of 1972, and it ended up getting worse. He ended up going into a coma, I believe, and ultimately died of multiple organ failure on the day after Christmas. So his date of death was December 26th of 1972. He had died at age 88. So rather long lived though, at least. So for the final 2 pictures that we have here, this is a picture of him in 1961. I believe it's 1961 with President John F. Kennedy in the Oval Office. So about 10 years after he'd left the Oval Office, he got to come back in. Which him and Kennedy did not get along at first. He had actually thought that Kennedy had somehow cheated at the Democratic National Convention in 1960 to get nominated, and urged him to reject the nomination because he thought that it was cheating. ultimately, him and Kennedy kind of did come around to each other a little bit, and they ended up talking a bit more during Kennedy's presidency. And it was ultimately Kennedy's death that kind of sparred him and Eisenhower, who were both present at the funeral, to kind of go back on talking terms. And then here we have a final picture of Mr. Truman and Bess as well, with President Johnson, his wife, and the Vice President Hubert Humphrey in 1965, when President Johnson is signing the Medicare bill that will give Bess and Harry their two Medicare cards to help pay for his medical issues. So here is President Johnson, who succeeded President Kennedy in 63. And then here we have President Truman and his wife, Bess. And then here we have Johnson's wife, um, Claudia. And then we have Hubert Humphrey, the current vice president at the time. So that concludes for Harry Truman, our 33rd president. So again, Mr. Truman is, I don't think, he's definitely not the worst president. I mean, I think he accomplished rather a lot for someone that came into office on the death of his predecessor. So I would rank him, I think, in our upper tier of them. But he's definitely a president that oversaw the end of World War II. He made possibly one of the most consequential decisions ever made with the dropping of the nuclear bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and then really set us up going into the Cold War for what the United States policy was going to be going into that against the Soviet Union, where we're going to stand by and let the Soviet Union kind of bully the world into communist submission, or were we going to actually take a stand against it, which we ended up doing under his watch. So that concludes for this video. So if anyone has any comments, any questions, or anything they want to add, or suggestions or anything like that, well, feel free to put it in the comments section, and I'll be more than happy to go through it when I can. So hopefully, I don't know what next week will be yet, but I'm still working on the ideas that I have. I got the one still working on trying to figure out how I want to do it, but I think I'm getting something worked around on that one. So we'll get to that one here pretty soon. I'd say within the next month we'll get to that one at least. So that concludes for this week. So hopefully everyone has a good start to their coming week, which I believe is supposed to be rather cooler here in Ohio at least. I don't know about elsewhere, but hopefully everyone stays well their coming week and have a good week off going into the Memorial Day holiday weekend, which is next weekend. And we'll see you all back here next week for whatever video comes out next.